Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will get started shortly. We're just going to give a few more minutes up until 12 for folks to join us. Again, good morning, everyone. We will go ahead and get started at 12, so just give us a couple more minutes. Oh, I mean 11:30. Sorry. I lost track of time. 11:30, sorry. Okay, perfect. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar on Trump's executive orders on immigration and what you need to know to navigate the changes and defend your rights. Before we get started, please note that this webinar and presentation is being recorded. And then we do have a few housekeeping items to go over. In any time during the webinar you have questions, please do utilize the Q&A box. We will also have some time after the presentation for us to go over any questions missed. There's also a closed captioning service available, so if you click the captioning tool, it will be made available to you. With that, thank you all for joining us today. With our current administration, executive orders have always been shifted and changed over the past weeks. So here today with attorneys from Immigrant Legal Resource Center, they will go ahead and provide us more information on what to expect, key changes, and then provide us valuable insights and clarity for us. Again, this session is being recorded, so with that, I'll pass it to Liz and Veronica.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here with us today. My name is Liz Taufa. I am a senior policy attorney and strategist with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center in the DC office. I am joined today by my amazing colleague, Veronica Garcia. She's a staff attorney in our San Francisco office. And we're just going to be going through some of the stuff that has happened here recently in the last 5 weeks or so. So just a rundown of what we're going to go over, just some intro, which we're doing right now. And then we're going to go over executive orders, some other administration actions that we've seen, how folks are fighting back, including both legal challenges and community challenges. We're going to talk about know your rights information, how you take action to defend your rights, what your rights are if arrested, and then we're going to leave you with some options and resources as we start sort of navigating through some of this new reality that we're in. We're going to do our best to leave some time for Q&A. It's a lot of information, and so it's a good thing the webinar is recorded because it's possible that we might skim over some stuff. So please feel free to lift up any questions you have in the Q&A chat box. We'll try to get to them either written or at the end. So here we are. For those of you who were with us for the webinar that was done on January 15th, we sort of were talking a lot about what we could expect and what we thought was going to be sort of upfront. And we've had, that's pretty much tracked, I think, with what we've seen over the last 5 weeks. We're just a little over a month in. And I think there have been some surprises, and the order of things has definitely been a little bit different. But one thing that I think we can all agree on is there's been a lot of movement and a lot of sort of dizzying news coverage, a lot of chaos. I cannot stress enough that a lot of what is happening is in violation of the law, both of our Constitution and just a regular statutory law. We've had kind of a troubling response from Congress in that it has been not much of a response from Congress. And so many of the things that are happening, not just in the immigration sphere, are a violation of the separation of powers. So there should have been a stronger legislative response, but there hasn't been yet. So that's not great news. We did see some congressional action, but unfortunately, kind of in the wrong direction with the passage of the Lake and Riley Act, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail a little bit later. And we continue to see anti-immigrant immigrant legislation being floated by Congress. Whether some of that will be passed or not remains to be seen. There's also issues of budget and reconciliation to consider. So we're in kind of an interesting place, but it has only been 5 weeks. So I wanted to just leave and start us off with some reminders that the first 100 days of a presidency are always the most productive. It doesn't matter who the president is. And the 100 days is going to be up on April 30th. So we're a little over a third of the way through. And so there's been a lot of stuff, but this is a long road. And so things may look very different in June, in October, next year, 2 years from now. I think things are going to look really different than they are now, but we are very much in the thick of things. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're going through some of this information. This is the quote unquote productive time of a presidential administration. And keep in mind also, there are special elections coming up in the House, and midterm elections are next year. So folks are going to really start earnestly running in the fall. So that's also going to change some things. There's also, and we talked about this in January as well, but there's a huge difference between the talk that's coming out of the White House and the federal government and the actions. And not to say that it's all talk and no action. There's obviously a lot of action that's happening. But a lot of the talk is meant to distract you from what's happening. So I'm going to plug several times throughout our time together today to stay informed. That's the most important thing you can do coming to events like this, finding trusted news sources, finding trusted organizations that can disseminate information like the ILRC. So please feel free to follow us on all the social medias. Please diversify your news intake, and find those trusted outlets, because what's being said and what's happening often are not the same thing. And understanding, having the clarity to know what's actually happening and how it affects you is one of the first tools in your tool belt when we're starting to fight back and resist some of this. Reminder, the chaos is by design. So if you're feeling chaotic, if you're feeling like there's too much going on and you can't get your head all the way around it, that's by design. That's how they want you to feel. We know that because they told us during the campaign and during the transition that that's how they wanted us to feel, that they wanted us to get bogged down so that we stop fighting back. But that is not happening. Fighting back is happening very staunchly. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the webinar. Our goal in doing events like this and other events that we have are to try and bring order to chaos, because order is the cure for chaos. And so the more informed you are, the more you know, the more we bring those actions that are actually happening and how they're affecting communities into the sunlight, the better prepared we are to fight back. So just by being here, you're joining in that cause. So I thank you for being here. So with that, I think let's sort of get into executive orders. So a little bit of background on executive orders. An executive order is, I've been calling them glorified press releases for several years now. They're not really that. They're actually just signed declarations of administration intent and directions to federal agencies. Basically, they are an indicator of what the administration's priorities are going to be. So the way it works is that the president signs an executive order directing the agencies to do something, to look into something, to stop something, to do something instead. And then the agencies then provide their own internal and external guidance on how they're going to follow the president's directions. And all of that has to be done within the confines of statutory law and the US Constitution. The agency actions can take the form of regulations, agency memorandums, internal policy docs, and usually we see a bevy of executive orders at the beginning of any administration. We saw a huge number of them come out of the Biden administration. We saw a bunch of them during Trump, et cetera, go on back. A lot of the executive orders are just rescinding the previous administration's executive orders. So we did see a lot of that as we got started in January. All of the executive orders are published on the White House website. So you can read them you can read them in their entirety if you want to. They're not very much fun. Trust me, as someone who has read them, don't read them unless you absolutely want to know exactly what's in them. Fun fact, they're right after the inauguration, if you went to whitehouse.gov, there played a Mission Impossible style movie that someone put together for Trump, and it's now been taken down. I'm sure you can still see it, but that was jarring. Not 12 hours after he had been inaugurated. So I want you to keep in mind as we go through a lot of this stuff, there is a lot happening. A lot of it is terrible. But all of the stuff that we're about to discuss is in the beginning stages. Again, we're only 5 weeks into this administration. And most of it is not fully baked yet. There are statements of what they want to do, statements of what they're intending to do, but there's not necessarily a lot of operation behind it. Everything is in flux and is going to be changing. Things are going to evolve. Litigation is going to continue. Congress is going to get involved, we hope. People are going to continue to fight back. Things are going to be feasible, not feasible, et cetera. So our aim here is to try and give you information of what we know right now, not to scare you, not to make you feel like things are hopeless by any means. Again, the best cure for the chaos and for what they're trying to do is having information. So that's what we're going to try to do, is give you as much information as we can. It's going to be a lot, might be a little overwhelming, but just take a deep breath with all of us. We're here to fight with you. And again, the first step in being prepared to fight is knowing what we're facing. So with that said, let's dive in. So a lot of the executive orders focus a lot on border and national security. That's probably not very surprising if you were paying attention during the campaign and the transition. There was a lot of really ugly rhetoric about an invasion at the southern border. That's been happening for years, particularly in Texas, aided by the Texas state government, that the United States was being invaded by folks coming across the border. So not surprisingly, a lot of the executive orders had to do with the southern border. So chief among them were a national emergency declaration saying that what was happening at the border was a national emergency that needed response. Essentially, a national emergency declaration just frees up resources to aid in whatever the emergency is. So you'll see that a lot if you look back historically with like natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, et cetera. Not that we've had, very large earthquakes here too recently. But that declaration of a national emergency or a state emergency just frees up funding. So for the border, this is usually going to take the form of more money for increased immigration enforcement officers and also more military deployment at the border. The same with the finding that there has been a mass influx of people coming across, people invading the country. That's a formal finding that's now in the Federal Register. It's on the books. It's really just a building block for other measures. So to sort of have that in their back pocket to sort of build on as they try to make more and more draconian decisions about what's going to happen at the border. The mass influx declaration is going to be probably used in ways to encourage cooperation with state and local law enforcement to do immigration enforcement, which we've seen in Texas already, but haven't really seen it operationalized. So there was a ceremony and a piece of paper that says, what's going to happen, but we haven't seen a whole lot of that operationalized yet, but it is starting to sort of come out. So something we're definitely keeping an eye on. Another one is the shutdown of the border. If you've seen any sort of DHS press releases, they are talking about how, apprehensions at the border are down 94%. We don't actually have any data to support that, but that's what they're saying in their press releases. But this is, again, stuff that we were all prepared for, is the return of the Remain in Mexico policy, the ending of the use of the CBP One app to, facilitate the parole programs that were set under the Biden administration, which have now been terminated. Talk about that a little bit later. There are still a lot of open questions we have about how the border is working, given that there were a lot of restrictions that were brought down by the Biden administration in the last 2 years, and how that's all going to work with the new measures that the Trump administration wants to take. So again, stay tuned. Still not 100% sure what that's going to be looking at. One thing that is pretty baked already, and something that we learned from the first Trump administration, was how the administration was going to handle applications for visas and immigration benefits. The language in the executive order directs federal agencies to do a number of things, including review the security screenings that countries do of their folks who are immigrating to the US. And if they find that those security screenings are lacking somehow, then they're going to try and institute sort of countrywide bans for immigration. All this to say, this is going to be very reminiscent of what we saw in the first Trump administration on the Muslim bans and the travel bans we saw. They're just going about it in a different way, rather than just, saying that, issuing an edict at night saying that no one can come in from these specific countries. Now they're going to say that they did a review process, and now these people can't come in from these countries. That we'll see that sort of start to pop up in visa issuance or non-issuance, as the case may be, and adjudications of applications as well. If folks are nationals of enumerated countries, specific countries, then we may start to see some issues with folks getting benefits for which they're entitled to, immigration benefits for which they're entitled to. We're also expecting to see a lot more scrutiny on applications just generally, which is going to slow things down. It's going to create longer backlogs and processing times as they engage in what they're calling vetting. We call it extreme vetting, where they basically go through and look for fraud, even where fraud is not indicated. It does slow things down. It takes away from resources. And it's all sort of it's all done under the guise of national security, but it usually results in unnecessary delays and looking for any kind of information that can potentially be used for enforcement. So that's what we're expecting there. Another thing folks have probably heard a lot about are the attacks on sanctuary cities. This again was a marquee issue for the Trump campaign, and continues to be a marquee issue for the administration. Although, again, we don't have a lot of information on the staffing for the office that's supposedly been set up, the task force at the Department of Justice to work on sanctuary cities. As far as we can tell, the only folks that are staffing it are folks that they're trying to get to quit, folks that don't, that used to work for components that they are not interested in having anymore, like the Civil Rights Office. So it's not clear what that office is doing or how effective they're being. A little bit of a background on sanctuary jurisdictions. The executive orders are advising that they're going to be going after any organization or any state or locality that is receiving federal grants that are administered by the federal government. If they're not in compliance with a law that is that says that state and local authorities have to communicate with DHS about a person's citizenship. So this is not the same thing as 287G agreements or local or state law enforcement agreement to hand people over to ICE. It's not the same thing. So basically, they'll be looking for violations of this law, and if they find them, then those states or localities that are not cooperating how they think they need to be cooperating under this law will lose their federal funding. They'll also be looking to prosecute sanctuary jurisdictions. We have seen that already. The federal government's already filed a lawsuit against Chicago and Illinois. California, interestingly, is already suing the government on their own for the sanctuary policies that have been enumerated. And they're also going after non-governmental organizations that provide services to undocumented folks and taking away their federal funding as well. So we've seen that already in stop work orders and funding freezes coming out of different agencies, which again, we'll talk about that in a little bit later too. Just a quick reminder, sanctuary cities, sanctuary policies have been found lawful by many courts over the course of the last couple of decades. So the law is certainly on the side of sanctuary policies, and the cooperation with law enforcement has been interpreted really narrowly. I don't know if that'll continue to be the case as our federal judiciary looks a lot different than it used to, but that the law is right now currently on the side of sanctuary jurisdictions, and we hope to see that it will continue to be so. A quick note about expedited removal. So expedited removal is a process that allows officials to quickly deport someone without a court hearing. Vero is going to talk a lot more about expedited removal and what to do if you are targeted for expedited removal. Expedited removal has been in the statute and has been policy for many years, but previously was only used really, much closer to the border or at ports of entry or an airport or something along those lines. So really more narrowly tailored, never a good thing to be able to usher somebody out of the country without affording them a court hearing, but it was limited in geographic scope. The expanded version, which again, this is left over from the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, was rescinded by the Biden administration and is now back, would cover the entire US for anyone who is in the US without a visa, parole, or some other admission, and can't show that they've been in the US for at least 2 years. So that's obviously very broad, wide ranging. The ILRC does have an expedited removal toolkit that we've just put out that we're happy to share with everybody. Again, Vero is going to talk more about expedited removal and how you can combat it if you are, if they try to put you in expedited removal proceedings. What we can say right now is that it's really unclear how how expedited removal is going to be applied nationwide. It never got fully operational during the first Trump administration before it was stopped by litigation. There's already litigation that's been filed to stop it this time as well. But as far as we know, application of expedited removal on the interior of the United States has been limited so far. But again, it's another potential building block. It's being raised as a threat in other areas. Whether or not that's lawful, though, is for the courts to decide. And so, well, we keep an eye on that litigation as well. But remember, this was in place during Trump 1.0, and we never really got any kind of operational guidance, or it never went all the way into effect because of litigation, and also because it wasn't really very clear, I think, to them what they were trying to do. Another thing folks may have heard about birthright citizenship. So there was an executive order signed on the first day that was attempting to leave children who are born to immigrant parents who did not have U.S. citizenship or lawful permanent residence, to attempt to leave those children without U.S. citizenship. So they would be born in the United States, and rather than follow the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which says anybody who is born in the United States is a U.S. citizen, rather than follow the Constitution, the executive order says that that's not true anymore. And directed federal agencies not to issue documentation that confirmed U.S. citizenship, like birth certificates or social security cards. So federal agencies don't issue birth certificates, that's state agencies. And so were this to go into effect, some state agencies may comply with that. Federal agencies that we're talking about would be like the Social Security Administration for the issuance of social security cards. This is a highly unlawful act. I don't know if I can express how unlawful it is. You cannot change the US Constitution by signing an executive order in a hockey arena, which is what happened. So this has already been enjoined by multiple courts. There are, I don't know, I think we're up to 10 or 12 lawsuits trying to get rid of this, and 4 or 5 of those lawsuits have resulted in injunctions. So this is not going into effect. It's not going to go into effect while the application is pending. The magnitude of the change that's being proposed is far too great for a court to allow it to happen while the questions of law are unanswered. Some of us think the questions of law are already answered, but that's for a court to decide again. So this isn't going to go into effect in any kind of near future at all. But the courts too, there's been some really great language that have come out of some of these court decisions that have said, this is blatantly unconstitutional, which of course it is. Another executive order, and this again is a trend that dates back to the first Trump administration, is an executive order on public benefits. This one actually did not come out on day one. This one came out, I think, last week. Basically directing federal agencies to review all programs that provide cash or non-cash public benefits, and to make sure that none of those are going to undocumented folks. And if they are going to undocumented folks, they need to stop going to undocumented folks immediately. This executive order is a really good example of the redundancy that exists when you're trying to scare people. Undocumented folks generally are already not barred from most federal, undocumented folks are already barred from most federal public benefits. Where there are mixed status families, where there are U.S. citizen children and undocumented parents, the U.S. citizen children are eligible for benefits, and it's not the same thing as an undocumented parent receiving those benefits. For now, I mean, while this is, obviously again, another marquee issue for the administration, we've seen this playbook before. The point is to try and scare people off of applying for benefits for themselves or for their children when they're eligible for those benefits, because they don't know how this is going to be applied. The language is really scary. And the fear really does have a very real chilling effect. And so folks go without services that they very much need. So this executive order on its own does absolutely nothing about the eligibility for public benefits, doesn't change anything. Medicaid, CHIP, SNAP, housing, all of that. If you are eligible before this executive order, you're still eligible. But remember, the chaos is the point, the fear is the point. And so the best recourse you have when this is what the tactics are is to arm yourself with information. There are a slew of executive orders. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them have to do with immigrant communities. Some of them have nothing to do with immigrant communities. For example, there's an executive order renaming the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf of America, which is useful for everyone. But some of the other executive orders that touch on immigration issues that I wanted to highlight, there are executive orders with really restrictive language on gender, recognizing only the two genders, recognizing only your gender assigned at birth is your true gender, which is geared toward the erasure of trans folks. But we are starting to see it in an immigration context when it comes to documentation. So in 2022, the Department of State started offering a third gender option on your passport application, so that if you did not want to choose male or female for your passport, you could have a third gender option. It would be a gender marker X on your passport. They've been doing that for a couple of years. There were several passports. There were a lot of passports that were issued with that third gender marker. We have gotten since some guidance that those passports that were already issued with gender marker X will be valid until they expire naturally, whenever they expire. But any applications that were pending, they were going to do the work to try and suss out what your gender assigned at birth was. And that was going to be the gender that they're going to put on your passport. So if you have documentation that you've gotten your birth certificate changed to reflect your accurate gender, they will not be accepting those. They will not be accepting those applications. So it really does. They'll be accepting the applications, but they may deny them, or they may take longer to adjudicate those applications. So it's really starting to set up a showdown between state identity documents and federal identity documents. We've also seen this we're starting to see this in some USCIS forms as well. Several USCIS forms over the course of the Biden administration were updated to allow for the third gender option as well. And so any applications with those pending are going to go through the same sort of inquiry, where they try to suss out what they think your gender assigned at birth was, and that's what they'll be putting on your documentation. So your naturalization certificate or your green card, for example. There are several EOs directed toward the reduction in federal workforce. If you've been watching the news, you've seen there have been massive layoffs at various government agencies. Executive orders were forcing folks to return to the office, and they've been remote since the pandemic. So this significant reduction in federal workforce across the government is mainly going to result in delays and chaos and delays in services for folks. So immigration enforcement is exempt from these reduction in workforce measures. We don't know if that includes the folks at USCIS, which is the Immigration Benefits Adjudicating Agency. So that's where you send your application for TPS and work authorization and your green card and your naturalization. So if there are reductions in workforces as well, we'll see the same sort of issues with resources being limited and delays in different things. They have frozen refugee admissions. They just essentially have stopped the refugee admission program in its tracks. It's very broad. It's currently in effect. It's being challenged, but right now there aren't folks being resettled in the States. And then we've also seen a number of funding freezes, many of which are geared toward immigrant serving organizations. There was the big expansive federal funding freeze memo that came out from the Office of Management and Budget, which was quickly stopped because that would have frozen literally every single dollar of federal money that goes into programs of any kind. So everything from SNAP to the CDC to things like the legal orientation programs, all of it would have been stopped. So that was quickly put down. But now what we're seeing are more tailored funding freezes by agencies. So one example is we've seen funding frozen for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Citizenship and Integration Grant Program, which is a program that provides funding for naturalization organizations that prepare folks for their interview and the civics and English tests at their interviews. So their funding has been frozen. So that's pretty much it. I mean, the executive orders are still coming, and there's just a lot now that's sort of splintering off from the executive orders. The executive orders, the language in the executive orders is always used as a basis for agency action. That's all administrations, not just this one. So we're starting to see some of the offshoots of that, some of the results, I guess, of that EO language and how agency heads are interpreting that EO language. And so one way we've seen it, there is just one sentence in the executive orders about TPS where they will be, it seems really innocuous. It's a line that just says that they'll be administering the temporary protected status program within the confines of the law, and that's it. And what it's being read to meant is that they're going to be terminating TPS. We've already seen it in two different designations. First for TPS for Venezuela. The administration canceled the most recent extension that was done right at the end of the Biden administration. So folks who were depending on 18 more months of coverage now do not have that. They also terminated the extension. So everyone that has TPS from Venezuela is facing a termination of their TPS designation. There is a lawsuit that's been filed to stop that. There's actually two lawsuits that have been filed. This is an additional issue for folks from Venezuela because of the lack of travel documentation that folks have, and you can't really get a passport from Venezuela. There's no embassy, et cetera. We've also seen a sort of a partial termination for TPS for Haiti for the most recent designation. Essentially, what the administration did is it cut off 6 months of eligibility for TPS. So that TPS designation that folks thought was going to terminate, was going to be over in February of 2026 is now over in August of 2025, which means the administration has until June to make a decision on whether or not they'll extend Haiti further and allow folks with TPS from Haiti to remain in the United States under temporary protected status. That I don't think there's no lawsuit that's been filed for that yet, but I imagine there'll be one soon. Another place where we've seen this is the termination of parole programs. The Biden administration expanded the use of parole pretty heavily. They did special categorical parole programs for folks from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, folks from Ukraine. They expanded what we call family reunification parole to additional countries. It used to just be available to folks from Cuba and Haiti, and then they expanded it to Central America and Colombia and Ecuador as well. So the termination of the parole programs happened really quickly after the inauguration, but there's still an open question on whether or not the administration will be revoking people's parole. Indications are that they will, and what that means to folks who have parole currently. If they are covered under something else, like say they filed an asylum application or something along those lines, then that should protect them from removal. But then there's another layer on top of that they've now decided that anyone who entered the United States in one of the parole programs that were expanded or created by the Biden administration, um, all applications that were filed by those people are now on pause because the assertion is that those folks were not screened or vetted appropriately when they came in. So they're holding onto their applications, and that's asylum applications, work authorization applications, whatever that particular person has filed is now on hold. We don't have a lot of information about that either. But we are, expecting to see a lot more delays as they try to suss out who entered with one of those parole programs, and whether or not they have set up new vetting or security screenings. We don't have a lot of information on that, but will undoubtedly result in application delays. Anecdotally, too, we've also seen a ramp up of immigration enforcement. There've been a lot of talk about how officials from other agencies like the IRS, the FBI, the Department of State, who have been deputized to do immigration enforcement. Again, we've seen this we've seen the statements, we've seen the press releases. We don't have a lot of information about the operation of that. We've also seen a lot of statements from officials. We've also seen some deputization of state law enforcement. Again, the only one we have confirmed on that is Texas, but I imagine we'll see other agreements between state and local law enforcement to do immigration enforcement. And again, we don't have information on how that's going to be operationalized. One thing I did want to highlight for folks is the passage of the Laken Riley Act. This was passed in January, I believe. And what this does is it greatly expands the use of something called mandatory detention to those who have been arrested, charged, convicted of theft offenses, offenses that result in death, bodily injury of another person, or assault on a law enforcement officer. This is particularly troubling because it doesn't require a conviction. It's just enough to be arrested on these charges. And if you're undocumented, to then put you into immigration detention without the possibility of a bond hearing. Remember, mandatory detention is a provision that allows ICE to hold you in detention without offering you a bond hearing. So any expansion of mandatory detention is obviously incredibly troubling, but it is particularly troubling to have it tied to arrests and charges instead of convictions. One other troubling thing about this is the speed at which it moved through Congress. I think we talked a little bit last time about the kind of capitulation of the Democratic Party to some of the narratives that we've seen coming out of the GOP about immigrant invasions and border security and national security. And so a good number of Democrats voted for this bill as well, and moved it through very quickly. You can't do that unless, with a narrowly divided Congress like we have, you can't do that unless there is bipartisan support, and there was significant bipartisan support. So that does kind of set the standard for anti-immigrant legislation coming out of Congress, at least for the next year, but we're hoping to see some of this pushed back. There's a lot of pushback happening, but these, if you haven't already called your congressperson, please do so, because the amount of legislation that's coming down the pike has the potential to be pretty catastrophic. But we'll see if it has any more legs. Again, they have to pass a budget and fund the government, which they were supposed to do that back in September, and we're still trying to get them to pass a budget. So we'll see what happens. Just sort of wrapping up here before I turn it over to Vero. Some of the things that we're watching in regards to the executive orders and what's already happened. Again, we're going to look for them to try and start banning folks from specific countries with whatever justification they come up with. Muslim bans were very much litigated during the first Trump administration, and I imagine these country bans will be litigated again. We are expecting to see slower application processing. You reduce the federal workforce, you increase fraud investigations. It's going to result in backlogs and processing delays. They're not likely to let up on sanctuary cities, including federal legislation. And we expect to see continued attacks on communities. The speech coming out of the government makes it pretty clear that they want to enact this. They're still trying to enact this mass deportation scheme, and put the full weight of the federal law enforcement behind it. But it's too soon to tell really if they're going to succeed. Um, I think the other thing we can definitely depend on is misinformation from a lot of sources, and some of it is intentional and some of it is not. There's a lot going on. Immigration is very complicated. It's an incredibly complicated system, but we are seeing reports of raids, ICE and different ICE enforcement that turn out not to be true and can lead to panic. So just be wary of what you're reading online, find your trusted sources, diversify your news intake, and be careful before you repost or spread information that you're sure of the validity of the resource. That being said, if you see ICE, feel free to connect with your local rapid response networks. Make sure that you can report ICE activity that you see with your own eyes to trusted sources like rapid response networks. And before I leave, I don't want to leave on a sour note. I do want to say that there are a huge number of legal challenges that have been filed. I put a link to the Just Security Litigation Tracker, which has been giving me hope when I feel like the weight of everything is too much and there's nobody fighting back. I look at that litigation tracker and I see the 75, 80 and counting lawsuits that have been filed, and I say, okay, well, there are people fighting back in addition to the rest of us. We've already seen some successful injunctions, birthright citizenship, stop work orders and funding freezes for federal programs. We've seen some success in the federal workforce, some with USAID, although it's a little bit tenuous as to whether or not they're listening to that court order. So we're starting to see the courts kind of catch up and really sort of testing the limits of what we have as far as our system of government, our separation of powers. I do see a lot of questions about the registry. So I did not, this actually came out yesterday after I was done with the slides. So so that's why it's not on here, and I do want to address it. So yesterday there was an announcement put out by the Department of Homeland Security that they are going to be requiring registration for undocumented folks. There's a list, and I can put it in the, I can see if I can put it in the chat, the USCIS guidance that was put up, because that is the extent of the information we have is one USCIS webpage. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to get everyone to who is undocumented or is not already considered to be registered, and there is an entire list of folks who are considered to be registered, to register essentially, but there's currently no mechanism by which to register. Supposedly they're coming out with a form that'll be available for online filing. That's not out yet, as far as we know. There are a number of problems with this move, aside from the sort of fascist tint to it. There are process problems with this. If you're going to create new programs that require people to give their information to you, there are regulatory processes that have to be respected. If you are going to create a new form, you have to put that form out for notice and comment. That none of that has been done and will likely not be done. So the chance of litigation and an injunction on this are high. For now, I don't think that, I mean, we're still sort of analyzing and seeing what it is. For now, I don't think it changes anything. As far as what our Know Your Rights guidance is, you still have the right to remain silent. You still have the right not to consent to searches. But at the very exact moment that we are in right now, there is no process to register. They have announced that there will be one, but there is not one. So if you are thinking of creating a MyUSCIS account in anticipation of this, maybe hold off for now until we get some more information. Yeah, so I'll go through the Q&A too and see what I can do to answer those questions. But for the most part, with registration, nothing has changed at the moment. It is just a DHS announcement. And I will put in the chat box, I will put a link to the USCIS guidance so you can read for yourself. But please stay tuned with ILRC, and we'll have guidance out on it as soon as we have it. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Vero.
Thanks, Liz. And thank you all those who are joining today. I know that there are a lot of questions, and a lot of our answers are more, we're waiting and seeing, right, than more concrete answers. So please do stay tuned and follow organizations like ourselves, right, and other trusted organizations to get updates and information as things change and shift. I'm going to spend the next part of our time together discussing how we could protect our rights, right, with all the announcements that are coming up. It's really important to understand what constitutional rights we have and how to protect ourselves and our community as we move forward and navigate the chaos, right? So just to get us started, I am going to talk about our rights in a two-step type of protection, right? So the first step is always to prevent arrest, right? If you are interacting with ICE, or if ICE or other immigration officials come and speak to you or are seeking someone around you, the most important thing to do in this one step is to prevent arrest. And how do we do this? What's the best defense for doing this? Is to remain silent. With us remaining silent, we ensure that we are not sharing information. And if immigration officials do not have information on us, we do not want to be the ones to provide it, right? And then there's a second step, right, that we need to consider is if we are arrested by immigration officials, right, or someone that we know is arrested by immigration officials, how do we shift how we, defend our rights, or what rights do we use in order to protect ourselves from being removed, right, and to get a hearing that we're constitutionally have a right to, right? So in this second step, right, if you are being arrested by immigration officials, or someone you know is being arrested by immigration officials, the goal here is to know how to prevent expedited removal, which is something that Liz covered, and to ensure that that person has a right to a hearing before an immigration judge and the ability to call an attorney that will help them in their case. Right. So under the step one, the most important thing to do is to remain silent and prevent arrest, right? So we're going to discuss why silence is so important and how this could help prevent arrest. I do want to give the caveat that, yes, we have constitutional rights and people have been asserting them, and they have been winning, right, and exercising their rights and preventing arrest. We know that immigration officials don't always respect our rights, and we have heard of some right violations, but we must do all we can to exercise these rights and to, ensure that they are respected to the best of our abilities, and that those rights are respected within our community to the best of the abilities. So what rights do we have, right? And this is a review for many of you. Many of you have been part of Know Your Rights presentations. So as you all know, all individuals in the United States have certain constitutional rights, regardless of their immigration status. So it doesn't matter if someone is a US citizen or someone is here undocumented. They have certain rights under the Constitution given to them by the Constitution. These rights include the right to remain silent, the right to a legal process before an immigration judge, the right to refuse to sign documents presented to you, the right to not have to produce documents, right? So your ID when you're questioned in certain situations, and the right to be protected against unlawful searches of your person and your property, right? So generally, right, if immigration officials approach you or approach someone, you have a right to assert these rights and refuse to answer questions, refuse to sign anything, refuse to give documents, right, and refuse a search if immigration doesn't have the proper warrant needed in order for them to do that. So the big question here that we get is, how do you know, or how does ICE have information on individuals, right? Because if ICE does not have information on someone, our best protection is silence, right? Usually ICE or immigration gets information of individuals if they have had previous contact with immigration officials. This could be that someone entered, you know, across the border by foot. They were stopped by a Border Patrol agent, and that interaction happened. It could be that someone has already filed an application for an immigration benefit, like a green card, like, you know, DACA, and immigration has the information of a person. You know, it could mean that someone has a pending case in immigration court, right? So they might have entered, they might have sought asylum, and now they have a case before immigration court, or maybe they were stopped in some way, that now they have had contact with immigration, and an immigration proceeding, you know, has started, where they are fighting their case in immigration court. And, you know, the other way that immigration gets information, and most commonly, right, if people haven't had contact with the immigration system, is that the individual gives the information to ICE or other immigration officials, right? So this includes answering questions, right? When people are questioned, answering questions around your place of birth, your nationality, your legal status. You know, for someone who has not had contact with immigration and might not have lawful status right now, the best case is to remain silent, because you do not want to give that information to immigration, right? You do not want to answer questions. You do not want to let them know what your place of birth is, or what your legal status is. So silence is golden, right? We've talked about this a lot. We've talked about it in other situations, right? Silence is golden. ICE can only arrest you if they have evidence that you are not a citizen of the United States, and you do not want to give them that information by answering the questions or giving them documents, right? And it's important that we all do this, right, to show a united front, regardless of what our own status is. So it's important to exercise our rights across the board, right? And if we are questioned, to remain silent, right? Because there's power in numbers, right? And there's power in, if you are stopped or ICE comes, right, that we all respond the same. And it's important to remember that being from a certain ethnic group, right, or and not speaking English, or speaking English with an accent, is not a valid reason for them to arrest you, right? So they cannot use that as the cause for them to further question you, right, or to say that they know that you are not, you know, a citizen of the United States, right? So remain silent, do not answer the questions, do not give them documents. If ICE approaches someone, we get a lot of questions of how an individual could answer, right? And usually when we speak to community members, right, we like to go through an exercise of how people could respond. They could respond verbally or nonverbal, right? Give a nonverbal response. And you know, we like to review these questions of where are you from, right? If you're asked, where are you from? It's important to answer that you are exercising your right to remain silent, right? And you're not going to answer the question. If you are asked, where were you born? Answering the same as you are exercising your right to remain silent and not answering the question. And if you're asked, what is your nationality? You know, answering that you are exercising your right to remain silent. And this is if you feel comfortable, right? Not everybody feels comfortable giving a verbal response. And I know that, you know, growing up, we're often told, right, to listen to authority figures. So it's perfectly understandable if you don't feel comfortable answering. That is why it's so great to have a red card, right? The red card could be a nonverbal response, as the image shows. So if you don't feel comfortable answering verbally, right, or if there's a language barrier, you could show the red card. The red card is you asserting these rights. They state these rights, you know, your right to remain silent, where you're asserting them, where they come from in the Constitution. And you could show this to the immigration official, and that is a way of asserting your rights. And that's, you know, the thing you should do whenever you're approached, right? Just show your red card, don't answer any questions. And if the interaction continues, right, and it escalates, you could ask if you are free to go, right? Because if you're not being detained, you should be free to go, and you could remove yourself from that situation. Another big question that has come up is, what documents should people carry, right? So a lot of individuals want to know, like, what should they keep in their wallet? What should they not keep in their wallet? Because even though we do have a right to not give permission for to be searched, right? We know that oftentimes it can happen, right? Immigration does violate people's rights. So for documents to carry, we tell people that the number one thing to carry, right, is the red card. The red card states our rights. Carry it in your wallet. A lot of organizations, a lot of colleges, a lot of community groups are handing out red cards right now. If you don't have one, you could go to our website and print one out for other people in your community. We do have tutorials on how to go about doing that. And we recommend that people carry a red card regardless of status, right? Because that's how we want to answer. We want to give a uniform answer if questioned, by showing the red card. The other type of documents that you could carry on your person is your state or local ID, or even a school ID, right? That shows your information. You could carry immigration documents, right? So if you have a work permit, right, because you have DACA, you could carry that. If you are a green card holder, because you're a lawful permanent resident, you could carry that. There is a recommendation that you could carry copies of these, right? They are expensive documents. If they get lost, you have to replace them. If they get taken away from you, sometimes it's hard to get them back. So it is possible to carry copies. I do want to note, though, that the law does state that green card holders or lawful permanent residents have to carry the original of their green card. But we have gotten some information that a copy should suffice, but it's definitely written in the law that you should carry the original green card. Other things to have is the information to a lawyer, right? So if you're working with someone right now on some sort of application process, right? You're filing for something within immigration and you do have an attorney, memorize that number, carry with you. So if you do end up detained, you could call them. The same, an emergency contact, right? So if you don't have an attorney, someone in your family that you could attempt to contact, right, so that they could get in contact with someone that could help you. It's important to memorize these in case you do not have access to your phone. I want to note that later on in today's presentation, we're going to discuss what other additional documents you should carry, especially if you are arrested, right, with other documents to show, so that you could get that hearing in immigration court. So what if you encounter ICE, right? And here I want to take a moment to discuss private spaces versus public spaces or public areas. It's key to understand what could happen in a private area and what could happen in a public area. And this is really important now, and we're getting a lot of questions about this now, in response to the elimination of the safe locations memo, right? So under prior administrations, there was this policy, right, that stated that ICE wouldn't go and do enforcement actions or arrest people in schools or churches or hospitals, right? But now that has been eliminated. So there's been a lot of questions of like, what happens if ICE shows up to a hospital? What happens if ICE shows up to a school? What happens if people are taking their children to school, right? Or if ICE comes and arrests the parent and can't, take the child, like what can you do? As we try to figure out or create policies that you could put in place to protect these areas, or protocol to put in place to protect these areas and navigate what you could do if ICE does show up, it's important to understand what could happen in a private space and what could happen in a public space or public area. So a private space is like your house, right? Or inside your car. It's spaces that need permission or judicial warrant for ICE to enter, right? And without those two things, ICE cannot enter, right? So they need a judicial warrant signed by a federal judge in order to enter those spaces, right? Or they need your permission, right? So if ICE comes and knocks on your door, you have a right to not open the door and not give them permission to enter. And if they don't have this signed judicial warrant with all the correct information, right, the name, the location, what area they're searching, then it's not valid and they cannot enter, right? If you are driving, you could deny them consent to search inside your vehicle, right? There are different caveats to this, right? But generally you could deny them to search inside your vehicle, and that is in a private space, right? So without permission, without that judicial warrant that's signed and has all the proper information, then ICE cannot access that space. And you do not want to give them permission, right? You want to assert the right to remain silent. You want to tell everybody in that space to remember that. In public areas like the streets or the public areas of hospitals and schools and churches, right? In those areas, ICE, like anybody else, could come in, right? And they don't need permission. They don't need a judicial warrant, right? They could come into those public spaces and access them, right? Like anybody else. But the private spaces within those public spaces, right? For those private spaces, they do need a warrant, right? A judicial warrant signed by a judge with all the correct information, or they need the permission of someone to enter those spaces. And remember that even if this space is in a public area, you do not have to give them permission to enter, right? So for example, an elementary school, right? If visitors usually have to come to the main office to get permission to get access to the school, then, beyond that space, you do not have to give permission to ICE to enter the rest of the school unless they have a judicial warrant or unless someone who has authority could give them permission, right? And there's a lot of protocols in place and a lot of different examples that are being posted by different organizations, right? That show what type of protocol you could put in place, right? So if someone comes to a school, for example, right, you could tell the person in charge, right? It could be the principal, that ICE has to go down to the central office, right, to talk to the district administrators, the superintendent, the attorney there, and they are the only ones that could review this policy, right, as an example, and have that be your policy, have that be the only person that could review this. There's also, other laws that protect information within the spaces in schools, right? And even in hospitals, right? What type of patient information could be shared, what type of school information could be shared, and also what areas, right, could be accessed, and what kind of requests are needed in order to access those informations, right? And for hospitals, right, even with the warrant, right, the warrant limits where someone could search. So even if they have that warrant, make sure that they only go to the place that is designated, right, that is stated in that location, and that other areas are not being able to access because they don't have permission under that warrant. And remember that even in these public spaces, you still have those rights, right? So you still have a right to remain silent, and you still have a right to refuse for them to search your person, search your property. And it's important to tell people of those rights that they have. And an example of like a private place within a public space would be if we are in a restaurant, let's say, the public space could be where people dine, right, where they eat, and private spaces could be, for example, the kitchen, right, because only employers are allowed to go there, or the restroom, the break room, right, that's the only place that employers are allowed to do. And in these spaces, it's good to mark clearly what's a private space and what's a public space, or what's a private space, right, so that they know that it's clearly marked and you cannot enter without permission or without a judicial warrant. Okay, so in private areas like your home, remember, right, best defense is to remain silent. If someone knocks, do not open the door. Assert your right to remain silent. Do not give ICE permission to enter your home. If someone wants to speak to them, you could go outside and close the door behind you and speak to them, review the warrant. But the best course of action is to not open the door. This is because ICE usually hardly ever has the proper warrant needed to enter a space, right? So they hardly ever have this judicial warrant needed to enter the space. So if you don't want to answer the door, you don't have to, right? You could ask, out loud and say, hey, who's there, right? But you don't have to do that. And you could step outside to talk to them, but make sure that you close the door behind you, right? Do not give them permission to enter. Remember not to sign anything and remain calm. If you want, you could slide under the door or show them through the window the red card saying that you're asserting these rights. State clearly that you are asserting your right under the Fifth Amendment to remain silent and remain silent. And after the interaction happens, make sure you call an attorney, right? And that you make note of what is happening, right? Once again, ICE rarely has a judicial warrant that gives them permission to enter. So the best course of action is to just not open the door. In public areas like streets, stores, if you're driving, if you're in a church or a school, remember, you continue to have the right in these public spaces, and it's important to exercise your right, right? So remain silent, assert the right to remain silent, do not sign anything, remain calm, do not consent to a search of your person or your property, right? If they continue to ask if you are free to go. If you're free to go, do not run or speed away. Do not use any false documents, right? And if you're in a space where they have asked people to get in line, do not get in the line, right? It's probable that once you're in line, they'll start interrogating you about your immigration status. So do not get in that line. Without a judicial warrant, ICE cannot enter the private areas that are located within public areas, right? Like you could say that in a church, it's like a prayer room. They cannot enter that. They cannot enter the back, maybe where, only employees of the church are able to enter. You could designate the private areas within this space. It's important that those responsible for that space understand how they're going to answer if ICE shows up. And if you are responsible for that space, you are within your right to ask ICE to leave, right? And not give access to the private areas. And likewise, it's important to take action and defend our rights. As I noted, ICE doesn't always respect people's rights, and oftentimes they get agitated and pester, right, to get the answers that they want. So it's important to protect and defend those rights of our, the rights we have in our community. If you are witnessing ICE activity, you are allowed to record. It's a big question that we get under the First Amendment. You have a right to record any law enforcement activity in public. And if you see it and you feel comfortable, please do record. It could be useful later on for someone's case, or to know what happened in the interaction, especially if they violated someone's rights. If you are recording, do not interfere, right? So don't try to prevent someone from being detained, right? But you could stand a few feet away, say you're recording. You could even stand a few feet away and remind people of the rights that they have, right? The right to remain silent, the right to not open, to not sign anything, to speak to an attorney. And we state that this could be a prime role for you as citizens, right? In case they do get agitated and they start questioning you, you are a citizen, you feel comfortable, you could do that. If you see any like ICE violations, right? So if ICE is either present, if you see someone being detained or someone's rights being violated, report it, right? You could report it to the ACLU that's local in your area. You could report it to one of the rapid response numbers, right? There's a rapid response network in California. Here's the link that lists the different rapid response numbers by area, right? And you could call them. They will go and verify that if ICE is actually present. They will connect you with someone who could help if someone is detained, and they are definitely noting if there are any violations of someone's rights. So please use it and report anything that happens. It's important to create a response plan and protocol, right? So if you are at home, if you even want to go down to who will answer the door if someone knocks, have that in place so that you know who's going to answer the door. Tell your kids, if you have kids, to not run and open the door, right? If you are in a public area or you work in a public area, it would be good to designate someone who will speak to an ICE officer if they show up, right? And also to have a protocol in place of what will happen, right? What will be followed, and practice that with the people who are in that public area with you, whether they're your employees, your students, etc. It would be good to designate someone who could review the warrant, right, to make sure that it is in fact a judicial warrant, right, that allows for that search and that it's valid, so that all the information is correct, the date, the time, where they have access to. Also understand who is in charge and who could deny entry, right, if they don't have a judicial warrant, and who could ask them to leave. And then if you don't know if your school or your work has a protocol, it's important to ask and see if you could create one. In California, the Attorney General's office has model policies for different spaces that we could provide the link to, that you could look as a starting space as you think about what protocols to create. A lot of places already have protocols, so it's important to ask and see what exists. And then like I mentioned, right, clearly mark private areas and make sure that everybody understands the protocol, right? All individuals, including children, right, understand the protocol and understand their rights in case ICE shows up. Okay, so in step 2, right, what rights you have if you are arrested. Here in the United States, people have rights to a legal process in immigration court before a judge with legal representation if they've entered with a valid document or visa, right? So this is someone who might have entered on a tourist visa, if that's how you entered, or you have a right to have a hearing before a judge, even if it's now expired. If you have lived in the United States for 2 or more years, you have a right of a hearing before an immigration judge. And if you are afraid of returning to your home country or have a pending asylum application, you also have a right to a hearing before a judge and to hire an attorney to help you with your process. We review this because of the expansion of expedited removal that Liz discussed at the beginning, right? This process used to deport people rapidly without the opportunity to go before a judge or the right to speak to an attorney right before they are deported, right? So important to assert your right to that hearing so that you could fight your case in immigration court and see what benefits you would have, you would be eligible for in that process. So how do you evaluate what to do, right? Because at the beginning, we spoke and we speak about the importance of remaining silent. That's always your first line of defense, right? So your first step, you always want to remain silent until ICE demonstrates that they have information on you, right? So don't take their word for it, right? Just because they tell you they have information about you doesn't necessarily mean that they're telling you the truth. ICE lies and is allowed to lie, right? So make sure that they demonstrate it either by showing you some sort of document that they have information on you before you speak, right? So your first line of defense is to remain silent until you know that they have information on you. If it comes to be known that ICE has information on you, right? Or you are being arrested, right? Things escalate and you are being arrested. You are told that you're not free to go. It's important to prevent expedited removal by showing them that it does not apply to you, right? And the first step you would want to do is to show them that you have lived here in the United States for 2 years or more, right? The second way, right, if you don't have those 2 years or more, right, you could show them that you entered lawfully or you have lawful status, right? You have DACA, you're a green card holder, you're a US citizen, right? You cannot be arrested, right? You cannot be removed. If you don't have those first 2 things, right, then, and you are afraid of returning to your home country, you want to assert that right and say that you are, you're afraid to return to your home country, right? And you would like a hearing. How do you figure out whether ICE has information about you, right? So you could figure this out by knowing, right, if ICE comes to your home or your workplace and calls you by your name and shows you an arrest warrant, that could mean that they have information about you, right? If you are in your home, you could assert the right to not answer the door, right, and remain silent. If you're not there, maybe you're not there, right? If they call by your name and they show you this document, it's probable that they have right information about you or they have information about you. If ICE has a signed judicial warrant or an arrest warrant for you, right, and they enter and they're able to search for you, right, it's probable that they know about you because they're looking for you, right? It's a targeted arrest. If you are scheduled for an ICE check-in, right, it's possible, right, they have information about you, you are going to this check-in, or ICE seeks you because of a prior deportation order, right? They know about you because of previous contact that you've had and they have come looking for you and they have identified you, right? You know that ICE has information about you. Remember that if ICE does not know who you are, the best defense is to remain silent. You will only break the silence if you know that they do have information about you. And if you are being arrested or have been arrested, right, here are some documents that you could use to show that you fit within one of the categories, right, of having a right to a hearing, right? So you have the physical presence of 2 years or more. You could use leases or rent receipts to show that you've been here, utility bills, income taxes, or pay stubs only if they have a valid Social Security on them. If they don't, please don't use them. school registration pictures with dates. If you entered lawfully, right, and you got an I-94, you could use that. Any stamps on your passports, right, any parole document. If you have a pending hearing, right, so any notice to the hearing, any credible for your interview that you've gone through, you could use that. Or if you have lawful status, right, a green card, you could use your green card to show that a grant of deferred action, like your DACA or U visa. If you have TPS, right, you could show that. So what else can we do to protect ourselves in these times, right? The most, it's really important that if you haven't, to get an immigration legal consultation and learn about your options. If you haven't had one in a while, please go and get one. We like to tell people to do it like we do doctor appointments, right? If we do it yearly, maybe things have changed. Maybe things have changed in your own life. Things have changed in the law. So it's important to go and speak to someone, someone that is trusted, right? That you could go and discuss your options. When you're there, you could discuss your eligibility for benefit. You could discuss eligibility for your family members, right? It could help you understand your options, right? Any benefits and risks when applying. Right now, it's really important to have that one-on-one conversation before you move forward and submit any application for an immigration benefit, right? Because you want to understand the benefits, the risks, and what's happening with the changes in policies and announcements, and get any question answered. You could also have a family preparedness plan in place. We've shared the link of how you could go about step-by-step creating this family preparedness plan. It could help you identify what you want to happen in case you're not here, right? With your family, with your children, with your property. It would help you keep that organized. It also helps you have an organized location for important documents and contact information. It could have in there any child care plan that you have for your children, whether you want them to remain in the United States or you want them to be to join you in your home country, right? I will note that on Thursday, ILRC will be hosting a webinar for family preparedness planning. We have the links here. We could share some in the chat. I believe the wrong link was shared, but I could reshare in the chat the right link to where you register for this. In English will be this Thursday, the 27th, and then there will be one in Spanish next Friday, March 7th. So we could come and learn more about options doing family preparedness, right? Which type of child care plan you want to have in place for your children, and also what other things we need to consider. Here we have other resources, like the red cards, how to assess, the risk of people who might face expedited removal, what to do if you are protesting. And we have these at our website as well. So you could just go to the ILRC website and the links will be there. And then just as a recap, remember, we all have rights. It's, first line of defense, remain silent. Don't open the door, don't sign anything, and try to stay calm. It's important to be prepared also. So speak to an attorney or a DOJ accredited rep who could help you identify options. And it's really important to stay informed, especially now as things are changing so rapidly. So I will leave it there and see if there's any questions we would want to answer out loud.
Thanks, Vero. So just kind of looking through, we've been trying to do our due diligence in the Q&A box. I've seen a lot of questions about, whether it's safe to file taxes, whether it's safe to go to ICE check-ins, whether it's safe to do, and I think in Vero's, please jump in if I'm overstepping here. I think the general answer is that we can't give you an answer that something is for sure 100% safe. We have heard anecdotal evidence that folks have gone to their ICE check-ins and it's been fine, and that folks have gone to their ICE check-ins and have maybe been detained. It's really a personal sort of inquiry that you're going to have to do after speaking to a trusted legal representative, a criminal lawyer if you have one, that sort of thing. You're really going to have to make the decision on your own. But I would venture to say that, there's nothing that is 100% safe or 100% not safe. But I don't know if you have anything to add there.
No, I think that's right. I think the best thing to do now is to get that consultation so you could identify any risks in your case, and nothing, unfortunately, we can't say with certainty one way or another anything.
I'm also seeing like some questions about forced entry and if a child opens the door and like, does that consider permission to enter? I did see a question about whether or not ICE is allowed to present false documents, and the answer is no, they are not. But yeah, I don't know, Vero, if you can speak to that, like if there's situations where, somebody underage opens the door or somehow some other way, or if they just force their way in, even if they don't have a warrant.
Yeah, I mean, if they do force their way in, even if they don't have a warrant, the best thing is not to interfere, right? Remain silent. Do not show them any documentation. Do not answer any other questions. And note what's happening, right? Because that could later be used to try and throw the case out, right? Because the information that they gathered was unlawful. For the child opening the door, right? That's hard, right? Because if a child opens, ICE will claim that you gave them permission, regardless of who opened the door, right? You could try to make arguments that children can't consent to things, right? Because they're young. But I've definitely heard of cases where children have opened the door and ICE has used that, entered, and arrested individuals.
I'm also seeing some questions about plane travel for folks. Is ICE at the airports? Is it safe for undocumented folks to travel domestically? And I don't know if we have a full answer to that question. I think that we will, yeah, I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that ICE will be at airports. I think one thing to flag is that the Real ID restrictions do go into effect on May 7th of this year. So that's just something to sort of keep in mind, since it's been the implementation of Real ID has been pushed many times. But I think it's definitely going into effect in May. So that should affect air travel for folks as well. Let's see. Travel is secure travel by ground in a car or by school bus. I don't know, Vero, do you have any thoughts on ground travel? Trains and automobiles.
It should generally, because of the type of documents that you're able to use, it's might be easier to travel by ground. I do want to note that 100 miles from any border, Border Patrol could get on a bus without a warrant, right? And they could search it without a warrant. And a lot of our countries within 100 miles of a border, right? Whether it's a land or sea border. So there's just that to keep in mind. But I know even with the implementation of the Real ID, because you might not need one to board a bus, it might be a better option than flying and not having to show your passport from your country.
I see a couple questions about the executive order on student visas and student protesters. So we just have the EO language on that. We don't necessarily have any more guidance out of the government so far. The language in the executive order on protesters is very broad. I think the language is folks who the government believes seek to undermine the fundamental constitutional rights of the American people, including but not limited to our citizens' rights to freedom of speech and the free exercise of religion protected by the First Amendment, who preach or call for sectarian violence, the overthrow or replacement of the culture on which our constitutional republic stands, or who provide aid, advocacy, or support for foreign terrorists. So, I mean, that taken with some of the directions to higher education institutions, they're instructing them to get rid of DEI, but they're also looking to have have there be monitoring the use, and like turning the sharing of information with immigration authorities. Again, we've only seen the executive order language on that. This sort of broad language along with some of the other pieces. It's possible that folks on student visas could be targeted based on their actions, engaging in peaceful protest. Also, organizations that advise on things like your rights and that sort of thing could also be targeted under this language. Again, we don't have any sort of guidance or implementation or regulation or anything like that. So right now it's just in the executive order. We'll see what kind of justifications are used under it, if any, at any point. But yeah, I mean, this sort of broad language again is intended, I think, to scare folks, but it is something that everybody should be aware of. We do have a guide for non-citizen protesters that we can post in the chat to make sure that that folks can have that and circulated as well. Here's a good question. Maybe Vero, you can answer this. To what extent do you recommend families complete a caregiver authorization agreement versus a more informal verbal agreement?
It would be good to do something more formal that would allow that adult to make decisions for the child in a school, right? So the caregiver authorization affidavit here in California allows that to happen versus just a verbal agreement might make it a little more, might make it harder, right, for that adult to make decisions for your child at a school. For a more in-depth discussion, I would encourage you to go to one of the webinars that we're doing on family preparedness, right? There's one on Thursday in English, one next Friday in Spanish. I put the registrations in the chat box because they will be discussing that more in depth and also the different options, right? Because there's the nonverbal that you could do, or not nonverbal, sorry, the verbal agreement, right? Which is very informal that you could do with someone. There's the one specific here for California, right? The CAA. We get a lot of questions about power of attorney, also whether that's a good option. So definitely join if you can. And the recordings will be available also on our website later on to learn more of the nuances of that.
I see a question here of whether naturalized citizens are at risk. I think it depends on the situation. Denaturalization was a sort of a marquee issue for the first Trump administration, and they have indicated that they want to ramp up denaturalization again. Denaturalization is a complicated process that involves multiple agencies and a lot of time. So, I mean, I think that, again, that's another similar to the birthright citizenship executive order. I think it's a similar thing that they're putting a lot of oxygen behind the idea that they would go after folks to denaturalize them en masse. But the actual reality during the first Trump administration was they did not end up going after thousands and thousands and thousands of people. They did go after more people than had previously been denaturalized. They did expand the categories of folks that they targeted for denaturalization. But I don't think that naturalized citizens are in any more danger than anybody else at this point. I do think that it's something to keep an eye on because because the rhetoric around it is really strong. But I think this is also a really good example of the rhetoric is really strong and really scary in an effort to scare people. And then when it comes down to it, they don't operationalize it as much as they say they're going to. I could be wrong about that, but that's definitely what we saw last time. So it's maybe what we end up seeing this time as well. Do you see any other questions that you feel like you can answer? Yeah, I've seen some questions about like creating plan Bs and worst case scenarios. I definitely recommend that folks go to the family preparedness webinar that's tomorrow. I lost track of the days, but yeah, some of these questions have probably been answered there.
Yeah, I also want to note, I know that there's a lot of really specific scenario questions of like how ICE could access, what documents you could use, what to do, and what areas you could mark privately. I want to note that we are working on a FAQ around some of these more nuanced questions that should be up in the next few weeks. So please come back. I think our resources are shared, right, to you all, but check out our website for more of that because a lot of these require more of a specific, less of a general answer.
I'm seeing a lot of questions about taxes, which I know is front of mind because of the news that the IRS agents are being deputized to be immigration officials as well. We can't answer those questions about taxes, but you definitely should speak with a legal representative, do a consultation and talk about your concerns. So yeah, I just wanted to address it because I've seen several questions now about taxes. Okay, we have about 1 minute left. So I don't know, Cynthia, if you have any closing remarks. I know that we have a survey for y'all to fill out.
Yep. And then with that, I think we've come to a close. I know we have a lot of Q&As that we weren't able to get through, but we'll go through some resources and link that with the PowerPoint and the webinar recording once that email is ready to go out. But other than that, thank you, Liz and Veronica, for supporting us today and hosting this webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.